We can sit here and I think quote a lot of statistics on, the impact on things like turnover and cost of replacement and all those types of things. But I actually think it goes much deeper than that. To your point, I think HR is developed very much out of a process mindset and a very process-driven domain to say, but this is the process, I standardize, I make it more efficient and I optimize it. And we all know the world of work no longer works that way. There's much more complexity, there's much more patterns and interdependence that HR needs to be able to navigate and deal with. And as we've mentioned earlier in our conversation already, I don't necessarily think HR has been geared to actually accommodate the complexity of the world of work here today in how we work, how we invest, and the skills that we build in. Now, to your question, and maybe to phrase it slightly differently, what happens if there's no HR today? Let's just say the function no longer exists. What is it that we actually lose out on, I think?
Welcome to the Systemic Talent Management Podcast.
Welcome everyone to the Systemic Talent Management Podcast. I'm Riddhika Khoosal and I'm joined by my co-host David Clutterbuck.
Hello.
And our exciting guest, Dr. Dieter Veldsman. Welcome, Dieter.
Thanks so much, Riddhika and David. It's lovely to be with you and look forward to our conversation.
For our listeners today, Dieter, if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about your background, your journey to date, and what even brought you into the field of HR.
Perfect. So, as mentioned, my name is Dr. Dieter Veldsman. I think I've had a bit of an unconventional career, if I may call it that. And it started out really with a love and an interest of human behavior. I've always been interested in why do we as human beings do what we do, and then specifically do what we do within the broader work context and in the workplace. So I started my career in organizational psychology. From there, worked across big corporates, did a lot of organizational development and organizational design work, got a lot more interested in how organizations themselves need to set up and the design behind that. So started a niche boutique consultancy focusing specifically on organizational design and strategic talent management. Moved and ventured a bit more into technology. So I ran an HR technology business for a couple of years focusing on employee engagement. I headed up the research and development side of things before going back to corporate, back into the HR fold, into the environment where eventually I became the chief HR officer for a multinational insurance business. Whilst on the other side, I've always been interested in the research side of things. So I'm also a professor at the University of Johannesburg, and I try to combine those two passions today where I'm the chief scientist at the Academy to Innovate HR, focusing specifically on what are the skills that we need to build in the HR professionals to make sure that we can deliver on a very different mandate into the future.
So not very busy at all.
No, not too bad.
That's a little bit about your teacher, and thank you for that. But let's get into the meat of what we're trying to talk about. So in this world of work that we're embedded in, it's being reshaped in so many ways. Most HR functions are not built for this. They're in a completely different world for which they're not prepared. We've got all the shifting demographics, we've got the skills crisis, we've got all the disruption from artificial intelligence. So where do you see the biggest gaps between what organizations need from human resources and what they're actually delivering?
I think there's a couple of places, David. I'm going to try maybe phrase it as three main domains and areas. And I think the first one starts with what we believe HR is and what success looks like. I think there's a very, very broad disconnect between, call it business and HR, in terms of the mandate that it's either afforded or the mandate that HR chooses to deliver on. So let me make that simple. I think very much when you ask somebody, what does good HR look like? If you ask 5 people, you'll get 25 different answers. And it's probably based on their own experience in the past, whether that experience has been informed by a good or a bad experience with an HR professional in the past. I think there's so much misconceptions about the contribution that HR actually can make to the organization, but it has to be in the confines. When I talk about mandate, it's a mandate of being able to say, I know what my contribution is. I'm not a partner to the business. I'm actually a core part of the business as a whole, and I've got a dedicated contribution to make, and that's understood by everyone else. Now, I start there because I believe if mandate is not clear, then everything that we do from there is trying to fix some certain symptoms. And I find today, and we do a lot of work where we ask business, what is the mandate of HR? And then we ask HR, and it's actually completely disconnected. There's this idea that HR always strives to be, the strategic business partner, and there's nothing wrong with that. But is that really what your business needs at the moment? Maybe your business requires really strong service excellence, solid operations. So I would say the starting point for me is the mandate conversation, and then that features and leans itself into the second point a little bit more around operating model. If your mandate's not clear, your operating model is going to be very disconnected from the rest of the rhythm of the business. And I think as HR professionals, and I say this with a lot of love and respect as a fellow HR professional, we get a lot of criticism there that we are not running in the same pace or speed or rhythm at which the business operates. And it's not for lack of trying. I just think fundamentally the operating models we have is dated. I think there's something new required that actually meets the requirements that you've mentioned, changing demographics, new talent strategies, AI. I don't think the way that HR has worked up to now is going to be the way that we need to work in the future. And then my third point there is that then boils down to capabilities and skills. So, if your mandate's not clear, your operating model is not the right one, then the actual capabilities and skills that you require from an HR professional, I don't think is quite there yet, because I think it has changed. I think when we look at what an HR professional is expected to do today, start thinking about things like digital data, AI fluency, these are not necessarily traditional HR related skill sets or things that people would associate with the HR professional. And I think the gap then kind of starts there, and it compounds on each other because we don't have the right mandate, we're not in the right model, and we don't have the right skills to execute on the expectation. And for me, there's the gap that we need to close.
So just to follow up on that, do you see
Mm.
this as a recently occurring gap, or something that that's been actually going on for a very long time? The reason I asked the question is, over 30 years ago, running a program with the UK CIPD, the Chartered Institute of Personnel Development, I ran a program. We got lots of HR people to ask their own people in their own organizations, so if HR didn't stand for human resources, what would it stand for? And of course, they got a lot of the answers were very funny. I think, the obvious human remains, but my favorite was hire and run, which was which was great. But they also got some very positive ones, sort of, being helpful and ready. But none of those responses actually related to the value that they added for the organization, which I found fascinating at that time. So I'm interested in your experience around that.
Yeah, I think it's ebbed and flowed, if I'm honest, right? So I think HR is definitely something that the HR profession has done really well, is I think responded to what was happening in the external environment and to what businesses were facing at the time. I do think, though, the response has always lagged a little bit. So I think the gap has kind of increased and then it's caught up a bit. And then I think it's increased again as the business started to shift and move forward, and then it's caught up a bit. What is interesting for me, David, with the point that you made, and we've had a similar experience recently, is nobody disputes that HR contributes value and that there's a contribution for HR to make. People are just not always necessarily clear or aligned on what that contribution is going to be. So I think for me, it's more a misalignment question as opposed to a gap that cannot be closed. I do think, though, that the speed at which we operate today has kind of exponentially started to increase that gap, which is probably why we feel it a little bit more. So I don't think it's necessarily a new problem, but I do think it is kind of exponentially larger at the moment, and I think a little bit more visible than what it might have been, 20, 25 years ago. But there's definitely value, but there's a disconnect around value contribution and how that translates into day to day.
Some would argue that what HR is experiencing right now goes beyond an operating model problem, that it's actually an identity crisis. Do you agree with that framing? And if so, what does it mean?
Yeah, I mean, you've opened a bit of a can of worms here, Riddhika, on the words identity, right? Because I think it's definitely one of my favorite topics to think of. Because when, we do talk about things like mandate, operating model, how people show up, there is a very strong component around identity. And if we define that as what is endearing and long lasting and the characteristics that make you who and what you are as a function, I think we have started to do work in the HR field to actually fundamentally change that. So if you think about HR in terms of very high level broad strokes, it originated in very much the labor relations type of movement in the early 1900s. Then we shifted towards this idea around, service excellence, personnel management. We moved towards human resource management as we know it today, strategic partnering. And I think we're on the cusp of a new movement again, but people have not quite defined what that means yet in terms of the role that HR needs to contribute in the new world of work, where AI and human beings need to work collectively and augment it together. So I think when you talk about an identity crisis, I think there's kind of stories of our past that informs us a little bit around where we find ourselves today as HR, but the sense making of what that's going to mean for the future, for me, there's a little bit of tension there that we have not necessarily quite resolved. I think the connotation with identity crisis is a negative thing, though, is maybe something to address, because I don't necessarily think it's a negative thing. I think it is important that we go and we do the work as a profession to start understanding exactly what it is that we want to become, because I do believe we are a little bit of a crossroads at the moment to decide what the contribution of HR is going to be in future. If we don't clarify that, and I think if we remain in this tension around our identity for too long, I think it will become slightly more negative. But you are absolutely correct. And I think there's work that the profession itself needs to do, there's work that organizations need to do, and there's work that individual HR professionals also need to do. Because if you think of the fact that, we did some research a while ago that 92% of HR professionals don't start their careers in HR. A lot of people then come from domains such as, administrative work, education, etc., which is beautiful for the diversity of the type of skills that you attract within HR, but it does not necessarily mean that there's a bit of a shared identity that you might find within finance, right? Where people have a similar background, they associate with the same type of things. There's almost a baseline level of knowledge and understanding and attachment to what the profession is. And for some reason, HR doesn't have that. And, there's also this idea for me that we need to really start. And when I say rebrand HR, I don't mean let's not change the name. I don't think it makes a difference whether it's called HR, human capital, people and culture. But let's fundamentally change what people associate with the word. Because let's be honest, nobody says, when I grow up, HR is that sexy profession that I want to be in. Most people kind of stumble into the profession. And I think that creates difficulty also about HR professionals knowing that they are valuable, knowing that they contribute, and then with all the other factors that we've already mentioned. So, this might be a very psychologist answer to provide to you, but I do think there's almost deep-seated identity work that the profession needs to do. And we do need to reframe that a bit for future, because I do believe it's an incredibly rewarding profession if you choose that, but there has to be certain caveats to that in terms of things that need to change in the environment.
Absolutely. I feel like that really circles back to the mandate piece of really then having that clarity around what it is that we're here to do and contribute, and how do we actually then serve the business? What do we want to be famous for, and what are we going to let go of? And without that clarity, how do you even begin?
Yeah, and your point around what are we going to let go of, right? That's the biggest mistake the HR profession has made over the years, is we've just added things all of the time. We're the one profession where if I ask anybody over the last 50, 60 years, what is HR no longer doing what they did before? That's a very short list.
Very
If I ask the
interesting.
question around what are we doing today that we never did before, that list is extremely long. Today we work in well-being, we work in org design, we work in org development, we work in strategic talent management, etc. But we not necessarily have let go of a lot of the, let's say, compliance, operational type of components. With that, I'm not saying it's not important. I'm just saying that I think it does distribute the mandate too broad in terms of what we are trying to do today. The biggest exercise we do with a lot of chief HR officers is say, what are you not going to do? If you were a business, what would you not have in your value proposition as an HR organization? Because you can't be everything for everyone. And business say, we are the solution for this group of people, but not for this group of people. Now, as HR, all of a sudden, we are expected to be the solution for everything. And I think that's a mistake that people make. So to your point, it comes back to mandate, comes back to identity, but it also comes back to really having the confidence to say, I am not that. I'm actually something different. And I think that's a difficult thing for HR leaders to be able to do.
If I were to summarize that, Dita, it's almost the more things you take responsibility for, the more things you're going to get the blame for.
I think so. It is so. And I think, David, also the more things you take ownership of, I think the higher the levels of expectations. And I don't necessarily think people have invested more in HR because the scope and the mandate is broader. That kind of has remained pretty much the same. So we've tried to spread ourselves way too thin with all the things that we had to try and do. And I think HR professionals in essence are resilient. So we've made it work in some shape or form or way, but I don't think that's sustainable anymore because we've reached that tipping point where I think it's no longer the way that we need to work. We just can't keep that up, I think, for the longer term.
What you're really speaking to here is actually the crux of why we started this podcast. This really is speaking to the shift of linear to systemic thinking. Can you say a little bit more about the importance of HR making this shift? And when HR stays linear in a world that isn't, what's the cost?
Yeah, and I think, we can sit here and I think quote a lot of statistics on, the impact on things like turnover and cost of replacement and all those types of things. But I actually think it goes much deeper than that. To your point, I think HR is developed very much out of a process mindset and a very process driven domain to say, but this is the process, I standardize, I make it more efficient and I optimize it. And we all know the world of work no longer works that way. There's much more complexity, there's much more patterns and interdependence that HR needs to be able to navigate and deal with. And as we've mentioned earlier in our conversation already, I don't necessarily think HR has been geared to actually accommodate the complexity of the world of work here today in how we work, how we invest, and the skills that we build in. Now, to your question, and maybe to phrase it slightly differently, what happens if there's no HR today? Let's just say the function no longer exists. What is it that we actually lose out on, I think? There's a couple of things. I think the first one, and maybe this is a little bit philosophical from my side, but I'm a firm believer in the idea of decent and meaningful work and that people deserve to have decent and meaningful work. I'm not naive enough to think that work is absolutely a vocation and everything for everyone. I think work fits into people's lives in different ways, but there has to be a body that governs the fact around how do human beings work and how can we help and design work that is actually meaningful, decent work that people want to do that does add a contribution towards broader society. Now, that's a little bit philosophical in nature. So to bring it one level down, I think there's also a massive thing in organizations around you do need the voice of HR that brings something different to the table. Some of the best advice I ever got when I was a CHRO, because I made the same mistake most CHROs make. I stepped into the boardroom trying to speak exactly like the chief finance officer, and the CEO pulled me aside and said, never forget what you actually represent at this table that nobody else brings. You bring a perspective and a view that nobody else has, so lean into that and be more assertive because it helps us make better quality decisions about an impact that we've never thought about. And I think that's the contribution that HR makes. You bring to the table a very different perspective and a scientific knowledge base pertaining to what does this do to human behavior? What does this do to how humans work, how humans are productive at work? How do we get the most out of our human capital within the organization in a responsible and in a sustainable way? And I really think that's the contribution. Earlier, you mentioned in the introduction that we are moving into a world where skills will be scarce. We are moving into a world where I think there's going to be really interesting things in talent over the coming years that's going to shift around how we think pertaining to mobility, etc. So HR, if it's no longer there, I fear that we will regress in terms of how we've progressed over the last couple of years around how work actually works today. And HR for me is the body that actually touches all those various different elements, because we are the one function that does look across the enterprise if you do your job well. We are the one function that does look across the different levels in terms of what our contribution is going to be. So I think that's what you lose out on in the broader organizational sense. It's always been interesting for me when you find business leaders that have encountered really good, solid, sound HR professionals, they cannot imagine a world without them. So there's something that they then start to click to say, but this makes me better. And we all know HR is a thankless profession. So if nobody tells you thank you, I think you're doing a fantastic, great job. You will know if you're not doing a great job. That typically you get that feedback pretty quickly. But I think that's what we're going to lose out on if we take away HR. For me, it's not about, the efficient processes. Yes, that for me is a ticket to the game. But there's something else in terms of the quality of decision making, the ability to bring the human into the fold, the ability to make balanced decisions about what's good for the organization, for the society, for the individual. That's the role that I think HR needs to play. And that's what we're going to lose out on if it's no longer there.
Thank you, Dee. That's very passionate, and and it paints a fascinating picture of, I guess, what happens if we don't do this.
Mm.
I mean, without HR, will we still have work? I mean, that's an extreme, but
Yeah. It's a great question, David, and I think it is a good one to ponder a bit, right? So I think there's one point of view that you can take to say, but things will just continue to run. And I think for a period of time, they will. I do think that for a period of time, things have been set up in a way that they can kind of maintain themselves. But if you look at globally, we know, and I mean, it's a different conversation, but we know engagement levels are going down. We know the workforce is much more anxious today than what it was. We are dealing with a lot of crisis at the moment that we will only really see the impact of how, AI is changing people's perspective towards work and the viability of work into the future. And I think that those things, we won't know what the impact is of not having HR in the shorter term. But I do think in 10, 15, 20 years' time, that's the pain that we're going to feel. And we'll look back if we had to remove HR today and say, but there was something there that we needed that was silent, that wasn't contributing in terms of what we wanted at the table. So if you ask me the question, does the world need HR? I would say absolutely. And you can pick up from my response, I'm super passionate about it. If you ask me the follow-up question, does the world need HR in the way, in the shape and the form that is today? Then I would say probably not. I think we need something slightly different that builds upon what we are today if we really want to kind of stake a claim in terms of saying, that this is what we bring to the world of work and to the future of work, which I think is going to be really, really interesting.
Thank you, Dieter. This shift from linear through to systemic. And when we talk about this a lot, it's difficult sometimes to envision exactly what that means, except when we see it being not linear thinking leading to problems. But in your mind, what does it look like in practice? What can we do in a practical way? And if you're an HR leader who wants to start making this shift, where would you start?
I think it's a great question, right? Because I think my first point there, if I'm an HR leader, was I think to change the mindset of both myself, my business stakeholders, and my own HR professionals around the fact that we are part of the broader system. We are not something that operates outside of it. And what I mean by that is this idea still that HR is a partner to the business still positions you outside of the system that contributes value. And I think that's the first mindset shift that you do need to make, because if you don't make that mindset shift, we've spoken today a lot about mandate. I think you get out of the point where you don't authorize yourself to take up the space, the resources that you actually require to make that contribution, right? So I think that's the first big thing you need to see. I think the second big thing is to make people aware of, and when I say the impact that we make, I think we very much often define impact in terms of the contribution that HR makes. I think you have to go one step further and say, what is different in the business because we did X, Y, and Z? Because I think that starts showcasing the systemic nature of the HR function as part of the bigger organizational system. And that for me is a very different narrative and a very different language that we bring into the organization and into how HR professionals position themselves and I think find meaning in what they do and what they then contribute. So I think there's a couple of those shifts that we do need to make. I think it starts with ourselves because nobody's going to give us that space. I hate the conversation around, HR's seat at the table. I think it's a moot point. We are at the table. Are you going to do anything with it? Are you really going to claim that space and showcase, why people should regret the times that you weren't at the table? So I think there is this component there to say that if we start thinking very differently, I think one, we've spoken about it, we change the mandate to be something that I think we are proud of and that the business needs. I think two, we redesign our operating models to be much more integrated into the business model, because I think that positions us very, very differently as something outside that looks in. We are a core part of the value chain. And three, I think it is then that conversation around being clear on your contribution and your value and where that shows up. Because I think if we build those three things, we then build HR professionals that has the confidence to actually lean into and find, Riddhika, your question, the identity, to be able to actually stand up and say, no, I'm proud to be an HR professional. This is what I bring to the table. And this is where I fit. Because I think ultimately there's that component that I sometimes worry when I listen to HR professionals. It's not clear that they know where they fit and how they fit into the bigger ecosystem. And, when you start talking about systemic, holistic approaches, if we don't solve that for people, they're always going to try and catch up with the system that keeps on evolving and changing. And if they're not part of that, I think that we will be left behind as a bit of a profession. So bit of an abstract, I think, answer there. So I don't think it's a step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4 type of thing. But there is really, for me, some deeper work that we do need to do to get us started. And I think HR leaders have all the right tools in the toolbox to do it. I think it's just about actually stepping up to the plate and doing it in a very different way.
Thank you, David. So HR is at the table, but what's on the menu? And
Exactly.
I'd like to follow that up with you. So we've talked about not keeping up. But how does HR actually drive the process?
So I want to maybe ask you a counter question, David, on that one. All right. So I sometimes ask a lot of HR leaders this: if HR was a business end to end that was responsible the same way that a business would be, how would you run it differently than today? And then all of a
Mm.
sudden, what's interesting for me is they start saying all the right things, right? We need a lot more financial discipline in the decisions that we make. We need a little bit more governance to make sure that we run the business on rhythms. We need a lot more clarity on what our value proposition would be. We need to understand and know kind of what our costs is going to look like and where we're going to make profit, etc. And I almost want to argue that I think it starts with HR adopting that mindset to say, if I was a business end to end, how would I run HR? What is it, the need that I'm solving for? And if I know what the need is that I'm solving for who? What is the target audience that I actually play in? And we've seen a lot of that movement, I think, of late when people start adopting a lot more employee experience type of approaches to how they design a lot of the traditional HR practices. But I think we do need to go slightly back towards the fundamentals to say, if this is my client, customer, consumer, whatever you want to call it, how do I solve for them? How do I solve for them in a way that is sustainable? How do I then run HR as an organization that has the same type of principles, that the rest of the business lines would have within an organization? When I was CHRO, I was in a federated operating model, and I used to make the joke to say group HR is also a business in its own right. We are also a vertical. That's the way that the bigger business operating model has been drawn. And if so, it means that I'm the CEO of an HR business, which means I have certain responsibilities that I need to fulfill towards the board, which was the ExCo at the time, as well as then also towards us as a leadership team in HR, carrying certain authority and responsibility to operate and drive in that way. So I think the starting point there is a bit of a shift in that, that mindset around not showing up as a support or as a partner function, but showing up as a business function or a line of business with a different scope of responsibility. And then I think that then starts to set you up a little bit to make it a slightly more meaningful and different contribution, if that makes sense.
And what would people in the business see differently if they followed that process?
I love it, right? So I sometimes joke with people, I say, if you're a consumer in the external world, and let's just use digital as an example, right? If you buy things online, you expect high levels of personalization, you expect recommendations that is literally automated in terms of what's going to fit and solve your problem. And you almost expect the people you do business with to know you so well out of the data that you've provided to them, obviously with consent, that they are able to recommend what is next for you that's going to optimize your experience. So I think if HR operates like a business, I think we will start seeing a lot more of those types of things where it's actually fit for purpose products that HR builds, because there's this idea that HR is a product, and if it's a product, it needs to be consumed in a particular way. I think we'll see HR businesses that are a lot more multi-channel in nature in terms of reaching more people more of the time. Because let's be honest, I think due to a lot of constraints in the past, I think HR has chosen which audiences to play for within an organization. And, there's reason for that and there's logic that sits behind that. I just think now we have the technologies and the tools to actually be able to operate at scale for the very first time in our history. Again, when I was in an HR leadership position, I analyzed kind of what our product set looked like, and I was super impressed when I came into the organization. And I said, but who is this for? Figured out that it was only for the 20% of people that were in campus environments. The rest of our field kind of sales force that was in the field never experienced any HR products because they were outside of the traditional fold. So I think employees will start shifting their view of when do I go to HR. I also think you will start moving away from this idea that these are HR things that I am now doing. I think you will start thinking about that as an employee, I'm now doing these things, which is important to me. I don't really care whether it's HR or IT or corporate services or marketing that sits at the back of that. And I think that will make HR very integrated. So in a weird way, when people stop thinking about the fact that when I'm putting in leave, having a performance conversation, doing workforce planning, when they stop seeing that as I'm now doing and engaging in an HR process, I think HR has done its work really, really well to transition towards this new area. I don't think that I'm doing an Amazon thing when I'm buying from them. I think about the fact that I'm fulfilling a need that I have at the moment. The fact that it lives on Amazon or which other platform doesn't really matter. And I think that changes then how HR shows up and what the role that it plays and how it is experienced and consumed, if I may call it that, by the different audiences that it serves.
As you were talking, I was immediately thinking of an Amazon model. And I'm just wondering, what does that make the HR business partner? Probably the Amazon delivery driver. So we can play with the analogy in many ways. But
Very much so.
it's a fascinating thought.
Listening to you speak, Dieter, it just reminded me of, as HR starts to more intimately understand the audience, that it serves the people in the business and the role that AI is now coming in with being able to provide such rich data and insights, what are your thoughts around, I guess, the governance around how much data will actually then be used and the human side of the conversation too, which I think we can acknowledge is super important when we're starting to look at the relationship between, AI or tech and the humans in the workplace. Just curious to hear your thoughts
Mm,
around how we navigate that insight, that road to insight and action.
yeah. And I think it's a great question. I think there's also, I think still a lot of uncertainties pertaining to the role that AI will play, right? I think the potential is enormous. I think there's also major risks that we are going to have to deal with. And I think in the shorter term, unfortunately, we are a bit in an environment where everything that happens currently in organizations is either blamed or accredited to AI, right? So if there's major layoffs at the moment, it's, oh, no, AI has replaced the workforce, which I don't think is necessarily true. I think it could be in some instances, but it's not the only reason. So I think there's a bit of a, call it a path to responsible AI that HR needs to guide the organization on. And for me, the first one is helping the organization own the narrative pertaining to AI, where they're going to use AI, building trust and transparency through the process within their workforce. So it becomes something that the workforce does not fear, but get excited about in terms of how it augments what they are able to do today. Now, that plays into, I think, this eternal fear that AI is going to take my job and it's going to replace me completely. And we had the same, a couple of decades ago when automation came into play. But I think there is a component there around actually making sure that that narrative is something that the organization steers in a very, very truthful way. I think there's a second part in that HR needs to really start helping us think about work design for the future. And I intentionally say work design and not job design because I think jobs are going to look very, very different. And I think AI does have the opportunity at the activity and task level to actually be a major contributor towards the way that we think about work at the moment. Now, you ask about the human element. I think the human being has to be brought along this entire process. If the human beings in ourselves, if we keep on fearing this and we don't know what AI is, I think we are going to lose human beings that won't engage and then won't necessarily reap any of the benefits that we find there. If we don't put in place the responsible governance mechanisms, and I think governance I use in a positive way here, not necessarily as a negative term or as a blocker, I think then we are going to kind of get into an environment where AI just runs away with us a little bit more and it starts accentuating the things that we don't want it to without really, I think taking a bit of a responsible view on how we bring it through the organization. There's interesting studies at the moment that showcase when human beings engage with AI, for example, through chatbots. If they know it's AI, they don't mind. If they think it's AI masquerading as a human being and then they find that out after the fact, they actually lose trust in that particular brand or in that experience because they said, you tried to lie to me, you weren't something that you said you were. And I think that's a very good lesson at a small scale for us to say that when HR guides how AI is going to infiltrate into the workforce, if I may call it that for future, we need to actually help people understand the role that it plays, the role that it doesn't play, and where the human contribution still sits in all of that. I am confident that we will figure out the data constraints that we sit with today. I'm confident that legislation will also catch up at some point around what can we use, what can't we use. But I think there's a more fundamental moral component there around how are we going to make sure that we still celebrate the human contribution through AI as opposed to it just replacing us. Now, you might be, pessimistic listening to the podcast and saying, so will AI take away jobs? Of course, it's going to change jobs. Every new technology has to, if it's worth its salt. The challenge to us is to say, how do we design with it as opposed to purely against it? And I think that's where HR can play a very, very key role to guide businesses a little bit through this next era. Last point I want to make on this one is I think there is also a contribution around what is management and leadership going to look like in a world where AI agents forms a key part of the workforce? Because that is going to be very different. There's so many organizational practices that rise and falls on the quality of the managers that you have in place, and yet it's the most stressful job, across the board. You get shouted at from the top and you get asked questions from the bottom. How can we actually utilize a lot of these things that's now available AI to actually rethink completely what do we want management and leadership to be in the future? And I'm not saying a new model, I'm just saying maybe releasing people to actually play those roles that we've always wanted them to, and not get them caught up in, the day-to-day processes that are important to run a business, but not necessarily, I think, the things that we really want to create that human connection.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. we've covered a lot of ground, haven't we?
We have. We've covered a lot of ground. Thank you, Dieter. I feel like we've been rapidly firing questions at you.
What would you say, Dieter, to round all this up? What's the one lesson or one thing that you would like to leave HR professionals thinking about right now?
Yeah. I think if I have to summarize it, you make an incredibly valuable contribution. Go out there and own it. And I think
Lovely.
it starts with that.
Thank you, Dieter.
Thank you so much. This has been such a wonderful and interesting conversation. My mind is definitely going to continue racing when we hang up for sure. But thank you so much for making the time.
Thanks so much, Riddhika and David. Thank you so much for having me. And as always, enjoy speaking to the two of you.
Brilliant.